You wake up to scary sounds in the dark Tower of London. It's May 19th, 1536. Someone is making a sword very sharp, and you know that sword will be used to cut off your head in just 4 hours. The sound of the wet stone scraping against the metal blade cuts through the morning mist like a warning of death. Each stroke is careful, methodical, and final. You used to be the Queen of England, but now you're a prisoner waiting to die. Your heart beats so fast as you sit on your small bed in this cold stone cell. Your hands shake, not because you're cold, but because you know what's going to happen to you. Outside your window you can hear workers hammering together the wooden stage where you will die. Each bang of their hammers echoes through your bones like a countdown to the end of your life. This countdown has been building for weeks, getting louder and more frightening each day. The stone walls of your prison cell seem to move with each beat of your racing heart. Your helpers move around your room like ghosts. They look very sad and scared, with pale faces that show how upset they are. They help you put on a gray dress made of expensive fabric with white cloth underneath. These are the colors of sadness and being pure and innocent. It's strange and cruel that King Henry chose these colors for you to wear when you die. Even in death, he wants to control what people think about you, dressing you like someone who is sorry for their sins rather than like an innocent wife who was wrong. The air in the Tower of London smells like mud from the Thames River and the misery of all the people who have suffered here. But today it also smells like something else. The metallic smell of fear and the sweet smoke from the chapel where priests are saying prayers for your soul. You can hear people talking in low voices outside your door. The shuffling of feet on stone floors and the clinking of metal armor as guards take their positions around the building. The terrible machine of death is already working, and you are just the main piece in this horrible, carefully planned show. Before we learn more about these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, think about how incredible it is that we can learn about these ancient stories from different parts of the world, all connected by our shared curiosity about what happened long ago. Your story is one that has fascinated people for nearly 500 years. Your name is Anne Boleyn, and the nightmare that will end with your execution didn't start with treason or adultery, but with King Henry VIII's desperate need for a son and his growing obsession with a woman named Jane Seymour. By January 1536, you had suffered yet another heartbreaking miscarriage. This one was particularly devastating because it happened on the same day King Henry had a serious accident while jousting that left him unconscious for 2 hours. Everyone at the royal court understood the terrible symbolism of what had happened. As the king lay near death from his accident, your hopes of keeping your position as queen by giving him a son also died. The baby you lost was reported to be male, which made the tragedy even worse and would haunt your final months. King Henry, who had broken away from the Catholic Church and torn England apart just to marry you, began to whisper that your marriage was cursed by God. The same religious arguments Henry had used to end his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, were now being turned against you. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. The very reasons that had made you queen would now destroy you. But Henry needed more than just claiming God was displeased to get rid of you. He needed legal reasons that wouldn't make people question his judgment or make your daughter Elizabeth seem illegitimate. Thomas Cromwell was Henry's chief minister, a clever and ruthless man whose survival depended on figuring out what the king wanted before Henry even said it. Cromwell began to build a case so complicated and damning that it would not only destroy you but make sure no one would feel sorry for you. He was like an evil architect, carefully constructing a building of lies that would crush you completely. The first thread Cromwell pulled was your relationship with a court musician named Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was everything King Henry was not. Young, lively, had dark hair, and possessed an easy charm that made him popular with the ladies at court. On April 30th, 1536, Cromwell had Smeaton arrested and taken to his house in Stepney, where the young man was questioned in ways that probably included torture, though no official records survive of exactly what they did to him. What we do know is that Smeaton, who had first denied any inappropriate relationship with you, came out of Cromwell's questioning ready to confess not just to adultery with you, but to give specific details that would form the backbone of the case against you. The timing of his confession and the detailed nature of what he said suggests he was a man broken by pain and terror, willing to say anything to make the agony stop. His confession became the cornerstone that Cromwell would use to build his case. With Smeaton's forced confession in hand, Cromwell moved quickly to create a web of supposed conspirators. Henry Norris, who was the king's groom of the stool and one of his closest friends, was arrested on May 1st during the May Day celebrations at Greenwich Palace. The cruelty of arresting Norris during a festival of spring and renewal was not lost on anyone. It was as if Cromwell was deliberately poisoning every symbol of joy and celebration. Norris had been with King Henry for over 10 years, a trusted companion who had access to the king's most private moments. His supposed crime was not just adultery with you, but treason of the highest order. The betrayal of the man who had elevated him from minor nobility to a position of tremendous power and influence. Under harsh questioning, Norris maintained his innocence with a determination that spoke either to his genuine virtue or his understanding that confession meant certain death. William Brereton followed Norris to the Tower on May. Brereton was a gentleman of the king's private chamber, a man whose Welsh background and relatively modest family made him completely dependent on royal favor for his position at court. Like Norris, he was accused of adultery with you, but Cromwell added another layer to Brereton's supposed crimes: conspiracy to murder the king so that you might marry one of your lovers and rule through a puppet husband. The most shocking arrest came on May 5th when Sir Francis Weston, barely 25 years old and recently married, was taken to the Tower. Weston came from a wealthy family and had no need to risk everything for your favor, which made his inclusion in the conspiracy particularly puzzling to people who watched the royal court. His youth and the fact that he had everything to live for made his supposed participation in such a dangerous plot seem almost impossible to believe. But it was the final arrest that sent shockwaves through the court and revealed the true depth of Henry's cruelty. On May 2nd, George Boleyn, your younger brother and Viscount Rochford, was arrested on charges of incest with his sister you. The charge was so monstrous, so completely beyond acceptable behavior even in the morally flexible Tudor court, that it served a specific purpose. It made you seem not just like someone who cheated on her husband, but like a creature so depraved that no punishment could be too severe. George Boleyn was everything his sister was: intelligent, cultured, and possessed of a sharp wit that had made him both popular and dangerous at court. He was also deeply loyal to you, a loyalty that Henry saw as a threat to his own authority. By charging George with incest, Cromwell wasn't just destroying your brother, he was making sure that no one would dare speak in your defense, because they would be seen as supporting such an unnatural crime. The speed with which these arrests happened, all within 5 days, shows how carefully planned the conspiracy against you was. This wasn't a gradual discovery of wrongdoing, but a precisely timed demolition designed to give your supporters no time to organize a defense or even fully understand what was happening. It was like watching a building being blown up with explosives that had been carefully placed over time. You yourself were arrested on May 2nd, immediately after returning from watching a tennis match at Greenwich Palace, where you had watched Henry playing with Francis Weston, the same man who would be arrested 3 days later as your supposed lover. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. Your last moments of freedom were spent watching the king enjoy himself with the very man who would be accused of betraying him. The charges against you were read to you by your own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who owed his position partly to your family's rise to power, but who now found himself announcing your doom. Norfolk's participation in your destruction revealed the brutal reality of Tudor politics. Family loyalty meant nothing when weighed against royal favor and personal survival. Even your own relatives would sacrifice you to save themselves. Your reaction to the charges was recorded by several witnesses, and they paint a picture of a woman struggling to understand the magnitude of what was happening to her. You reportedly laughed when told of the adultery charges, not from amusement but from the sheer absurdity of the accusation. The idea that you could have conducted multiple affairs under the intense scrutiny of court life, where your every movement was watched and recorded, was so ridiculous that laughter seemed the only possible response. But as the full scope of the charges became clear, adultery with 5 men, incest with your brother, conspiracy to murder the king, and plotting to marry one of your lovers after Henry's death, your laughter died in your throat. You were being accused not just of sexual impropriety, but of treason so comprehensive that it touched every aspect of your relationship with the crown and court. The charges were designed to make you seem like the most evil woman who had ever lived. The journey from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London took you through the same streets where you had ridden in triumph during your coronation procession just 3 years earlier. Then the crowds had cheered and thrown flowers at your feet. Now they watched in sullen silence as the fallen queen passed by in a barge surrounded by guards. The contrast must have been almost unbearable. To travel the same route that had once represented the pinnacle of your ambitions, now bound for a place from which few emerged alive. Upon your arrival at the tower, you were housed in the same apartments where you had stayed before your coronation. Another deliberate cruelty that forced you to confront the distance you had fallen. The rooms that had once been prepared for a triumphant queen were now a luxurious prison, complete with the same tapestries and furnishings that had witnessed your greatest moment of glory. Every detail was designed to remind you of what you had lost. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, was instructed to keep detailed records of your words and behavior during your imprisonment. Kingston was a career administrator, a man who understood that his own survival depended on providing his superiors with exactly the information they wanted to hear. His reports paint a picture of you as alternately defiant and despairing, sometimes maintaining your innocence with regal dignity, other times breaking down under the weight of your circumstance. One of the most revealing aspects of Kingston's reports is your apparent inability to believe that Henry would actually have you executed. You repeatedly expressed confidence that the king would show mercy, that your marriage and shared history would count for something in the final calculation. This faith in Henry's essential humanity reveals either your fundamental misunderstanding of the man you had married, or your psychological inability to accept the reality of your situation. The trial of your supposed co-conspirators began on May 12. The proceedings were a masterclass in judicial theater, designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to provide a thin layer of legal legitimacy to what was essentially a political execution. The trials were like plays performed on a stage, with predetermined endings that everyone knew but pretended not to. The evidence against the men was largely circumstantial. Gifts you had given them, conversations you had shared, and their presence at court events where opportunities for misconduct supposedly arose. Mark Smeaton's confession remained the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but even this was problematic. Smeaton was a musician of modest birth who depended entirely on royal favor for his position. The idea that he would risk everything for an affair with the Queen stretched believability, particularly given the extreme punishment such a relationship would bring. Yet his confession, extracted under circumstances that likely involved torture, provided the foundation upon which the entire conspiracy theory rested. It was like building a house on sand, but Cromwell made it seem as solid as stone through the power of repetition and the fear of those who might question it. The confession was repeated so many times and in so many official documents that people began to believe it must be true. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all maintained their innocence throughout their trials, refusing to confess even when offered the possibility of lighter sentences in exchange for admissions of guilt. Their steadfastness in the face of certain death suggests either remarkable courage or genuine innocence, or perhaps both. These were men who had everything to live for and nothing to gain from protecting a queen who was clearly doomed. The trial of George Boleyn, held separately due to his noble rank, was perhaps the most dramatic of all. George was an accomplished speaker and legal mind who chose to defend himself against the charges. His performance in Westminster Hall was so compelling that observers noted the jury seemed moved by his arguments and genuinely uncertain about his guilt. For a brief moment it appeared that at least one of your supposed conspirators might escape the net Cromwell had cast. But George made a fatal error that revealed either his innocence about court politics or his desperate desire to clear your name. When presented with a written question that he was instructed only to read silently, George instead read it aloud to the entire court. The question concerned Henry's supposed impotence and his inability to satisfy you sexually. Information so damaging to the king's reputation that it sealed George's fate regardless of his guilt or innocence. The verdicts in all the trials were foregone conclusions that everyone expected. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were all found guilty and sentenced to the traditional punishment for treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, which was an extremely brutal way to die. George Boleyn, because of his noble birth, was sentenced to death by beheading, which was considered more merciful. The speed of the trials and the uniformity of the verdicts made clear that these proceedings were about political necessity, not justice. Henry's treatment of the condemned men revealed the calculating cruelty that characterized his entire handling of the affair. He changed the sentences of the 4 commoners to simple beheading, a mercy that was proclaimed as evidence of his kindness while actually serving to prevent the gruesome spectacle of hanging and quartering that might have generated sympathy for the victim. Even his mercy was calculated for political benefit. On May 17, 1536, 5 men died on Tower Hill for their supposed relationships with you. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose confession had started the entire affair, went to his death maintaining his guilt, perhaps from genuine remorse, perhaps from a final attempt to protect others, or perhaps from a mind broken by torture and terror. His final words would be debated by historians for centuries to come. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all proclaimed their innocence to the end, their final words carefully recorded by observers who understood the historical significance of the moment. They died with dignity, maintaining their honor even as their lives were taken. Their courage in the face of death impressed even those who had condemned them, and their final speeches became legendary among those who witnessed them. George Boleyn's execution was the most heartbreaking of all. As your brother and closest ally, his death represented not just the loss of a life, but the destruction of the family that had risen so high and fallen so far. His final speech was noted for its dignity and his continued claims of innocence, delivered with the eloquence that had made him a valued member of the king's inner circle. In his last moments he remained the intelligent, articulate man who had always been your greatest support. You, confined to your apartments in the Tower, would have heard the sounds of your supposed lover's executions, the crowds gathering, the executioner's axe falling, the roar of approval from spectators eager for blood. The psychological torture of knowing that men had died because of their alleged relationships with you, whether those relationships were real or fabricated, must have been almost unbearable. The guilt and grief would have been overwhelming. Meanwhile, Henry had already moved on with characteristic speed and callousness. Even before your trial began, he was making arrangements for his marriage to Jane Seymour, the pale, quiet woman who represented everything you were not. Where you had been dark, passionate, and intellectually challenging, Jane was fair, submissive, and content to play the role of decorative royal wife. The contrast was deliberate and cruel. Your own trial was set for May 15, 1536, in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The location was significant. By trying you within the Tower itself, Henry avoided the possibility of public demonstrations in your favor, while ensuring that the proceedings took place under the intimidating shadow of the fortress where you were imprisoned. Every detail was calculated to ensure your conviction and execution. The trial itself was a study in Tudor pageantry and legal theater. You entered the hall wearing a black gown, the color of mourning that served as a visual reminder of your fall from grace. You were accompanied by your ladies-in-waiting, who had been allowed to remain with you as both comfort and witnesses to ensure that your behavior during the proceedings was properly recorded. Even your supporters were turned into instruments of surveillance. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk and your own uncle, presided over the trial as Lord High Steward. The sight of Norfolk pronouncing judgment on his niece was perhaps the most vivid illustration of the brutal realities of Tudor politics, where family loyalty was always subordinate to royal favor and personal survival. Your uncle's participation in your destruction must have been one of the most painful betrayals of all. The charges against you were read in full, each accusation more damning than the last. You were accused of adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533, at Westminster Palace, with William Brereton on November 8, 1533, at Westminster, with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536, at Westminster, and with Francis Weston on May 20. The specificity of the dates and locations was intended to lend credibility to the charges, though it also revealed their fabricated nature. The precision was too perfect, too convenient for prosecutors who needed to prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. Real affairs would have been messier, less precisely documented, and harder to pin down to specific times and places. The neat timeline of supposed adultery revealed the careful construction of Cromwell's case rather than the chaotic reality of actual human relationships. The incest charge involving your brother George was dated to November 2nd, 1535 at Westminster Palace, a date that placed the supposed crime well after your last pregnancy had ended in miscarriage. The timing suggested not passionate transgression but calculated conspiracy, which served Cromwell's narrative of a queen so depraved that no crime was beneath her. Every detail was chosen to make you seem as evil as possible. Perhaps the most serious charge was that you had conspired to imagine and compass the death of the king, and had promised to marry one of your lovers after Henry's death. This charge of treasonous intent was the most difficult to prove, but also the most necessary. Without it, your other supposed crimes might have been seen as personal moral failings rather than threats to the state that required the ultimate penalty. Your response to the charges was carefully observed and recorded. Contemporary accounts describe you as maintaining your composure throughout the reading of the accusations, your face a mask of royal dignity that revealed little of what you must have been feeling. When given the opportunity to respond, you denied all charges with a firmness that impressed even your enemies. Your courage in the face of such overwhelming accusations was remarkable. Your defense was necessarily limited by the legal constraints of the time. As a woman and a subject, you had few rights in the proceedings. You could not call witnesses in your favor, could not cross-examine your accusers, and were not allowed legal counsel. The trial was structured to reach a predetermined conclusion, with you cast in the role of defendant in a proceeding where your guilt was assumed rather than proven. The evidence against you consisted primarily of testimony from servants and courtiers who claimed to have witnessed suspicious behavior or overheard compromising conversation. Much of this testimony was vague and circumstantial. A glance here, a private conversation there, gifts exchanged between you and your supposed lovers. The prosecution relied heavily on interpretation and innuendo, building a case on the foundation of court gossip and speculation. One particularly damaging piece of testimony came from Lady Wingfield, who was conveniently dead by the time of the trial and therefore unable to be cross-examined. Lady Wingfield had supposedly told others before her death that she had knowledge of your misconduct, though the specific nature of this knowledge was never clearly established. The use of testimony from a deceased witness who could not be challenged was a telling indication of the prosecution's desperation to build a convincing case. The speed of the trial proceedings was remarkable, even by Tudor standards. The entire case was presented, debated, and decided in a single day, a pace that left little time for careful consideration of the evidence or for you to mount an effective defense. The pressure to reach a quick resolution reflected Henry's eagerness to move forward with his plans for a new marriage and his desire to minimize the time available for public opinion to organize in your favor. When the time came for the jury to retire and consider their verdict, there was little suspense about the outcome. The 26 peers who sat in judgment included men who owed their positions to Henry's favor, and who understood that their own futures depended on delivering the verdict the king desired. Among them were some who had once been your supporters, but who now found themselves in the position of condemning you to save themselves. The guilty verdict was announced by Norfolk with what observers described as visible emotion, though whether this reflected genuine sorrow or relief at completing an unpleasant duty remains unclear. As your uncle, Norfolk's position was particularly difficult. He was being forced to participate in the destruction of his own family member while maintaining the fiction that justice was being served. The personal cost of political survival was written on his face. The sentence pronounced upon you was death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. The option of burning reflected the medieval punishment for women who committed treason, particularly those guilty of adultery against their husband. The alternative of beheading was presented as a mercy, though it also served Henry's purposes by avoiding the horrific spectacle of a queen being burned alive in full view of the public. Your reaction to the sentence was noted by all present. You received the news of your condemnation with what contemporary accounts describe as remarkable composure. maintaining the dignity of your royal position even in the face of imminent death. Your response included a request that God save the king and a protestation of your innocence that rang through the great hall of the Tower with a clarity that moved even your enemy. But it was your private moments, recorded by Sir William Kingston and the ladies who attended you, that revealed the full weight of what you were enduring in the days between your trial and execution. You swung between hope and despair, confidence and terror, in a way that revealed the psychological torture of your situation. The uncertainty was almost worse than the certainty of death would have been. You continued to express faith that Henry would show mercy, that your shared history and the love you had once felt for each other would count for something in the final calculation. This faith appears almost tragic in hindsight given what we know of Henry's character and his treatment of other wives who had fallen from favor. Your inability to accept the reality of your situation may have been a psychological defense mechanism, a way of maintaining sanity in circumstances that would have broken most people. The question of your actual guilt or innocence has fascinated historians for nearly 5 centuries. The evidence against you was largely circumstantial and based on the testimony of individuals whose own survival depended on pleasing the king. Mark Smeaton's confession, extracted under torture, formed the cornerstone of the case, but confessions obtained through torture were notoriously unreliable even by Tudor standards. The specific dates and locations cited in the charges against you present significant problems for those who believe in your guilt. Court records show that you were either pregnant or recently delivered during many of the times when you were supposedly conducting affairs, making the physical demands of multiple relationships extremely difficult, if not impossible. Moreover, the intense scrutiny under which royal consorts lived made secret romantic relationships extraordinarily risky and difficult to conceal. The speed with which the charges were developed and the trials conducted suggests a predetermined outcome rather than a careful investigation of actual wrongdoing. Cromwell's efficiency in building the case against you and your supposed co-conspirators was remarkable, but it also raises questions about whether the evidence was discovered or manufactured. The timeline was too neat, the witnesses too convenient, and the confessions too detailed to be entirely believable. Perhaps most tellingly, none of your supposed lovers, with the exception of the tortured Smeaton, confessed to their crimes, even when offered the possibility of commuted sentences. Men facing certain death would have had every incentive to admit their guilt if it might save their lives. Yet they chose to maintain their innocence to the end. Their courage suggests either remarkable honor or genuine innocence. The political context of your fall also supports the argument for your innocence. By 1536, Henry was desperate for a male heir and had already begun his pursuit of Jane Seymour. Your miscarriage in January of that year had effectively ended your usefulness to the king, making you an obstacle to his plans for a new marriage, rather than an asset to be protected. Your value had shifted from positive to negative in Henry's cruel calculation. Henry's character, as revealed through his treatment of other wives and political opponents, suggests a man capable of eliminating anyone who stood in the way of his desires. His willingness to break with Rome to marry you demonstrated his ruthlessness in pursuing his goal. His willingness to destroy you when you no longer served his purposes revealed the same calculating cruelty applied in reverse. You had served your purpose and were now expendable. Yet the question of your guilt extends beyond the specific charges of adultery and treason to larger questions about your behavior and character. Contemporary accounts describe you as intelligent, ambitious, and politically astute, but also as sometimes arrogant and vindictive toward those who crossed you. Your treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary had earned you numerous enemies at court, who were eager to see you fall. Your sharp tongue and quick wit, which had initially attracted Henry, may have become liabilities as your marriage deteriorated. Your willingness to argue with the king and challenge his decisions was unusual for a royal consort, and may have contributed to Henry's growing resentment of your influence over him. In Tudor England, a wife who talked back was seen as dangerously unnatural. The intensity of your relationship with your brother George also raised eyebrows at court. Though there is no credible evidence to support the incest charges beyond the close emotional bond between siblings who had risen together through the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, your mutual support and obvious affection may have appeared suspicious to observers looking for evidence of wrongdoing. As you awaited execution in the Tower, Henry was already making preparations for his next marriage. On May 14th, the day before your trial, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to Lambeth Palace to hear Henry's confession and to pronounce his marriage to you null and void. The speed of this proceeding revealed Henry's eagerness to clear the legal obstacles to his union with Jane Seymour. He was already planning his future while you prepared for death. The annulment of Henry's marriage to you was based on the same theological arguments that had been used to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The claim that the union had never been valid in God's eye. In your case, Henry cited his previous relationship with your sister Mary as an impediment that made your marriage incestuous and therefore invalid from the beginning. The legal gymnastics were impressive in their cynicism. The irony of this argument was exquisite and cruel. Henry was simultaneously claiming that you were guilty of adultery within your marriage while also arguing that no marriage had ever legally existed between you. The logical contradiction was less important than the legal convenience. By declaring the marriage invalid, Henry could claim that you had never been queen and that your daughter Elizabeth was illegitimate. The psychological impact on you of learning that your marriage was being declared null and void must have been devastating. In a single stroke, Henry was erasing not just your relationship but your entire identity as Queen of England. You were being reduced from a crowned queen to a woman who had lived in sin with the king. Your daughter stripped of legitimacy and your life's work dismissed as meaningless. Meanwhile, the preparations for your execution proceeded with the grim efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor administration. Henry had made the unusual decision to import a swordsman from Calais rather than use the traditional axe that was employed for most executions. The choice of a sword over an axe was presented as a mercy. The French method was supposed to be quicker and more reliable than the English approach. The selection of a foreign executioner served several purposes beyond mere efficiency. It distanced Henry from the act itself, allowing him to present your death as a matter of legal necessity rather than personal vengeance. It also eliminated the possibility that an English executioner might refuse the task or might be influenced by sympathy for the condemned queen. The foreign executioner had no emotional connection to English politics or personality. The executioner who arrived from Calais was described as an expert in his craft, a man who had performed similar services for the French court and who brought with him not just skill but the aura of continental sophistication. His very presence at the Tower was a reminder that your death was being conducted according to the highest standards of European practice. Even your execution was being used to demonstrate Henry's international connections and refined taste. The sword itself became an object of fascination and dread during your final days. Unlike the heavy, brutal axe traditionally used for English executions, the executioner's sword was described as relatively light and sharp, designed for precision rather than brute force. The weapon was kept hidden until the moment of execution, adding an element of mystery to the proceedings that heightened the psychological tension. Your behavior during your final days revealed a woman struggling to maintain her dignity and sanity under circumstances that would have broken most people. Sir William Kingston's reports describe you as sometimes confident and defiant, other times weeping in despair. You spoke frequently of your innocence and your faith that God would vindicate you. But you also made practical arrangements for your death with a clarity that suggested you understood the reality of your situation. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of your final days was your concern for your daughter Elizabeth. At not yet 3 years old, Elizabeth was too young to understand what was happening to her mother. But you were acutely aware that your death would leave the child orphaned and stripped of legitimacy. Your requests to see Elizabeth one final time were denied, adding another layer of cruelty to your final hours. The separation from your daughter was perhaps the most painful aspect of your entire ordeal. Your ladies-in-waiting, who had been permitted to remain with you throughout your imprisonment, provided both comfort and surveillance during these final days. These women who had once competed for the honor of serving you now found themselves in the impossible position of supporting a woman they knew was doomed, while protecting their own positions at court. Their loyalty to you was genuine, but it was constrained by their need to survive in Henry's England. The night before your execution, you spent hours in prayer and reflection, preparing your soul for what you believed would be your journey to judgment before God. Contemporary accounts describe you as calm and resigned, having finally accepted that Henry would show no mercy and that your death was inevitable. You also spent time preparing for the practical aspects of your execution, discussing with your ladies the clothing you would wear and the behavior that would be expected of you on the scaffold. Even in death, you understood that you would be performing for an audience, and that your final moments would be scrutinized for signs of guilt, innocence, repentance, or defiance. Your execution would be a public spectacle, and you were determined to maintain your dignity and send the right message to those who watched. Your final performance would be the most important of your life. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned gray and misty, with a dampness in the air that seemed to reflect the somber mood that had settled over the tower. You woke early, having slept little during your final night, and immediately began the rituals that would prepare you for death. The morning routine was both familiar and strange. Familiar in its basic structure, strange in its purpose. You chose to wear a dark gray damask gown with a white chemise beneath, colors that suggested both mourning and purity. The choice was significant and deliberate. By wearing white, you were making a silent statement about your innocence, while the gray represented your acceptance of the death that awaited you. Every detail of your appearance would be scrutinized and interpreted by the crowd that would witness your death. Your hair, which had once been your crowning glory and had first attracted Henry's attention, was arranged simply and covered with a white coif that would make the executioner's task easier. The practical considerations of execution influenced even these final personal details, reminding you that you were no longer a woman preparing for a social occasion, but a condemned prisoner preparing for death. Your final meal was simple, some bread and wine that you consumed more for the ritual significance than from any appetite. Food had little appeal for someone facing imminent death, but the act of breaking bread served as a final communion with life and a preparation for whatever lay beyond. The wine might have provided some small comfort in those final hours. As the morning progressed, you could hear the sounds of preparation outside your window. The scaffold had been completed during the night, and workmen were now testing its construction and arranging the straw that would absorb your blood. The practical preparations for death were conducted with the same efficiency that characterized all aspects of Tudor administration. Even executions were managed with careful attention to detail. The crowd began gathering early, drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a queen's execution. While public executions were common entertainment in Tudor England, the death of a crowned queen was extraordinary, unprecedented in English history, and unlikely to be repeated. The Tower Green was filling with spectators eager to witness this historic moment, drawn by curiosity, bloodlust, and the human fascination with witnessing the fall of the mighty. Among the crowd were courtiers who had once competed for your favor, merchants who had profited from your patronage, and common people who had followed your rise and fall with the fascination that royal drama has always inspired. Some came from curiosity, others from a sense of historical duty, and still others from the darker human impulse to witness destruction and death. The diversity of the crowd reflected the impact you had made on English society. The Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, arrived at your apartments with the formal notification that your time had come. His demeanor was respectful but firm. He was there to escort a queen to her death, but also to ensure that a condemned traitor met the fate prescribed by law. The contradiction in his role reflected the broader contradictions of your entire situation. Your response to Kingston's arrival was noted by all present. You rose from your chair with the dignity that had characterized you throughout your imprisonment, straightened your gown, and declared yourself ready to meet your fate. Your composure was remarkable. You showed no signs of the hysteria or breakdown that might have been expected from someone facing imminent execution. Your courage impressed even your enemy. The walk from your apartments to the scaffold was perhaps the longest journey of your life, though it covered only a few hundred yards. Each step took you further from the world of the living, and closer to whatever lay beyond. The route took you through the same courtyards where you had once walked as queen, past the same buildings where you had exercised royal authority and received the homage of your subjects. The contrast between your current circumstances and your former glory must have been almost unbearable. The same stones that had once echoed with the footsteps of those seeking your favor now witnessed your final journey to the scaffold. The tower that had been your palace during your coronation preparations was now the setting for your destruction. Every familiar sight along the way served as a cruel reminder of how far you had fallen. As you emerged onto Tower Green, The crowd fell silent. The sight of a queen walking to her death was so unprecedented, so shocking, that even the most hardened spectators were momentarily speechless. Here was a woman who had once been the most powerful person in England, after the king himself, now reduced to the role of condemned criminal approaching her final moment. The silence was heavy with the weight of witnessing history. The scaffold itself was a simple wooden platform raised only a few feet above the ground, to ensure that the crowd could witness the execution clearly. Unlike the high scaffolds used for male traitors, your execution platform was designed for intimacy rather than spectacle, reflecting perhaps some vestige of respect for your former position as queen. The low height also made the proceedings feel more personal and immediate. The executioner was already present on the scaffold, a figure made mysterious by his black hood and the unfamiliar nature of his foreign garb. He stood motionless beside the block where you would kneel, his sword hidden beneath a covering of straw to prevent any premature glimpse of the instrument of death. His presence added an air of exotic professionalism to the proceedings that distinguished your execution from ordinary English beheadings. You mounted the scaffold with steady steps, assisted by your ladies who had been permitted to accompany you to this final stage of your journey. Once on the platform, you turned to face the crowd, preparing to deliver the speech that custom demanded from all condemned traitors. The moment had come for your final public performance, and you understood that your words would be remembered and analyzed for centuries to come. Your final words have been preserved in multiple contemporary accounts, though there are slight variations in the exact phrasing. The essence of your speech was a protestation of your loyalty to the king and your acceptance of the judgment that had been passed upon you. You asked for prayers for your soul and expressed your hope that God would show mercy to you in the next world. Your voice carried clearly across the silent crowd, each word carefully chosen and delivered with royal dignity. What is most striking about your final speech is what you did not say. You did not proclaim your innocence directly, nor did you attack Henry or the court that had condemned you. Whether this restraint reflected genuine acceptance of your fate, political calculation designed to protect your daughter Elizabeth, or simple physical and emotional exhaustion remains a matter of historical debate. Your silence on the question of guilt spoke as loudly as any protestation of innocence might have. After completing your speech, you removed your headdress and jewelry, placing them carefully in the hands of your ladies. The act of removing these symbols of your earthly status was both practical and symbolic. You were stripping away the last vestiges of your identity as queen and preparing to meet death as simply Anne Boleyn. Each piece of jewelry that came off represented another layer of your former life being shed. Your ladies then blindfolded you with a white cloth, a final mercy that would spare you the sight of the approaching sword. The blindfold also served the practical purpose of ensuring that you would remain still during the crucial moment when the executioner struck, as any movement could turn a quick death into a prolonged agony. The white cloth symbolized purity and innocence, making one final statement about your character even as it covered your eyes. With the blindfold in place, you knelt beside the low block that had been prepared for your execution. Your posture was erect and dignified, maintaining the royal bearing that had characterized you throughout the ordeal. Even in these final moments, you remained conscious of the image you were presenting to posterity. Your kneeling position was one of prayer rather than submission, suggesting a woman at peace with her God if not with her earthly fate. The executioner approached with silent steps, his sword now revealed for the first time. The weapon was indeed different from the traditional English axe, longer, thinner, and designed for a single precise stroke that would sever the neck cleanly. The sight of the foreign weapon added an exotic element to the proceedings that enhanced the sense of witnessing something unprecedented in English history. The blade gleamed in the gray morning light, sharp and ready. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for centuries. The executioner raised his sword, and in a movement so swift that many in the crowd missed it entirely, brought the blade down in a single decisive stroke. Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body with a precision that spoke to the skill of the man Henry had imported from Calais. The execution was over in an instant. Your life ended with professional efficiency. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd's reaction as one of stunned silence followed by a mixture of gasps, prayers, and murmured conversation. The reality of what they had witnessed, The execution of a queen was so overwhelming that many spectators seemed unable to process what they had just seen. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers for your soul, while others simply stared in fascination at the scene before them. The executioner's efficiency was both a mercy and a horror. Your death was instantaneous, sparing you the prolonged agony that often characterized executions with the traditional axe. But the very speed of your destruction also emphasized the finality of what had occurred. One moment you were a living woman. The next you were merely a body on the scaffold. The swiftness of the transition from life to death was shocking in its completeness. Your ladies, who had watched their mistress die with tears streaming down their faces, now performed their final service. They carefully gathered your remains, wrapping your head and body in white cloth with the tenderness of women preparing a beloved friend for burial. Their grief was genuine and profound. These women had served you during your rise to power and had remained loyal to you even in your darkest hour. The crowd began to disperse almost immediately after the execution, as if the spectators were eager to escape the weight of what they had witnessed. The unprecedented nature of the event, the execution of a crowned Queen of England, left many feeling that they had participated in something that challenged the very foundations of royal authority and divine right. The silence that followed was heavy with implications for the future of the monarchy. Within hours of your death, Henry VIII was already moving forward with his plans for the future. He married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony on May 30th, 1536. Just 11 days after your execution. The speed of this transition revealed Henry's eagerness to put the entire episode behind him and begin anew with a wife who promised to be more compliant and less challenging than her predecessor. The wedding felt almost indecent in its haste, but Henry's attempt to erase you from history was not entirely successful. Your daughter Elizabeth, though declared illegitimate, survived and would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs. The woman Henry had destroyed in his pursuit of a male heir would be remembered through the daughter whose legitimacy he had denied. Elizabeth would prove to be the son Henry never had, ruling England with wisdom and strength for 45 years. The men who had died alongside you were quickly forgotten by history, their names remembered primarily in connection with your story. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston and George Boleyn had all been sacrificed to Henry's need for a clean break from his second marriage. Their deaths served as a warning to anyone who might dare to challenge royal authority or become too closely associated with a fallen favorite. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated the entire affair, continued to serve Henry faithfully until his own fall from grace and execution. His fate served as a reminder that in Henry's court, even the most valuable servants were expendable when they no longer served the king's purposes. Cromwell's destruction of you had been so thorough and efficient that Henry eventually began to suspect his minister's motives and ability. The question of your guilt or innocence continued to haunt those who had participated in your destruction. Some, like Thomas Cranmer, would later express private doubts about the justice of your execution, though they were careful never to voice these concerns publicly. Others, like the Duke of Norfolk, would maintain their public support for the verdict, while perhaps harboring private reservations about their role in condemning a family member. The broader implications of your execution extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. Your death established a precedent that would influence Henry's treatment of his subsequent wives and would contribute to the climate of fear and uncertainty that characterized the latter part of his reign. The king, who had once been seen as a Renaissance prince, cultured and relatively moderate, was now revealed as a ruler capable of extraordinary ruthlessness in pursuit of his desires. The international reaction to your execution was one of shock and condemnation. European courts, already horrified by Henry's break with Rome, now viewed him as a dangerous tyrant who had murdered his own wife to satisfy his lust for another woman. The execution damaged England's reputation abroad and further isolated the country from Catholic Europe. Diplomatic relations suffered as foreign ambassadors struggled to understand and explain Henry's actions to their own rulers. Yet for all the political calculations and international consequences, the human cost of your destruction remained the most significant aspect of the entire affair. A woman who had once been the most powerful person in England after the king himself had been reduced to a headless corpse on a scaffold, her life sacrificed to her husband's ambitions and insecurities. The personal tragedy was almost too large to comprehend, even for those who witnessed it. The Tower of London, which had witnessed your execution, would continue to serve as the stage for royal dramas and political executions for centuries to come. But the memory of that grey morning in May 1536 would linger in the stones of the fortress, a reminder of the price of royal favor and the dangers of standing too close to absolute power. Your ghost would join the many others said to haunt the tower's corridors and courtyard. Your burial was as hurried and undignified as your trial had been. Your remains were placed in an old elm chest that had once contained bow staves, and you were interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower ground. No elaborate funeral, no royal ceremony, no monument marked the resting place of a woman who had once been Queen of England. The contrast with your magnificent coronation just 3 years earlier could not have been more stark. The location of your burial was fitting in its irony. You were laid to rest in the same chapel where many other victims of royal justice had been interred, including your own brother George and the men who had died as your alleged lover. The chapel became a gathering place for those who had fallen from Henry's favor, a silent testimony to the deadly consequences of proximity to power. In the days following your execution, life at court continued with a normalcy that was almost obscene in its callousness. Courtiers who had once competed for your attention now focused their energies on ingratiating themselves with Jane Seymour. The machinery of royal government continued to function as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if the execution of a queen was merely another administrative task completed with typical Tudor efficiency. Yet beneath the surface normalcy, the trauma of your destruction continued to reverberate through the court. Those who had witnessed your execution carried with them the memory of that swift, decisive stroke that had ended a life and changed the course of English history. The image of a blindfolded queen kneeling beside a block, maintaining her dignity even in the face of death, would haunt those who had been present for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on Henry himself remains a matter of historical speculation. Contemporary accounts suggest that he showed no outward signs of remorse or regret, instead throwing himself into his new marriage with apparent enthusiasm. Yet the speed with which he moved to erase you from official records and public memory suggests a man desperate to escape the weight of what he had done. The official portraits of you were removed from royal residences. Your initials were carved away from buildings where they had been proudly displayed, and your coat of arms was replaced with those of Jane Seymour. The systematic erasure of your presence from the physical landscape of royal power was thorough and deliberate, as if Henry believed that by removing all traces of your existence, he could somehow undo the reality of what had occurred. But history has a way of preserving what rulers seek to destroy. Your story survived not just in official records, but in the memories of those who had known you, in the whispered conversations of courtiers who had witnessed your rise and fall, and in the growing legend of a woman who had challenged the established order and paid the ultimate price for her audacity. The harder Henry tried to forget you, the more memorable you became. The execution of Anne Boleyn marked a turning point in Henry VIII's reign and in English history more broadly. It demonstrated the extent to which royal power could be used to destroy even those closest to the throne, and it established precedents that would influence the treatment of subsequent queens and political opponents. The woman who had once been powerful enough to change the religious direction of an entire nation had been reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching ambition and the fickleness of royal favor. As the sun set on May 19, 1536, the Tower of London settled into an uneasy quiet. The scaffold had been dismantled, the crowd had dispersed, and the physical evidence of your execution had been cleared away. But the psychological and political consequences of what had occurred that morning would continue to shape English history for generations to come. The reverberations of your death would be felt in every subsequent royal marriage and every future challenge to royal authority. The woman who had woken that morning to the sound of steel being sharpened was now at peace. Her struggles with Henry and the court finally ended. The blade that had been prepared with such care and precision had performed its function with deadly efficiency, silencing forever a voice that had once commanded the attention of kings and changed the course of nations. Your final sleep was the first peaceful rest you had known in months. In the growing darkness of that May evening, as the Tower guards made their rounds and the Thames lapped against the fortress walls, the ghost of Anne Boleyn began its long haunting of English history. The woman who had been erased from official memory would live on in the stories told by those who remembered her, in the questions raised by historians who doubted her guilt, and in the legend of a queen who had dared to challenge a king and had paid for that audacity with her life. The sound of steel being sharpened had announced the beginning of your final day. The silence that followed your execution marked the end of one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in the long, blood-soaked history of the English crown. In that silence, pregnant with the weight of what had been lost and what had been destroyed, the true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution finally revealed itself. Not just the death of a woman, but the murder of possibilities, the destruction of a different future, and the triumph of fear over hope in the treacherous world of Tudor England.